All right. Pact of Umar. So, Pact of Umar. So, you're a Christian living in the newly Muslim Middle East.
Ooh, I like it.
In order to be protected by the law, there's a few rules you have to follow. You can't build any new churches. You also can't rebuild any of the old churches that were destroyed when the Muslims took over. You can't put any religious you can't put crosses on your churches to identify them as churches. You're not allowed to own weapons. You can't wear Muslim clothing. You're not allowed to try and spread your religion to Muslims. And you can't build your house taller than the house of a Muslim neighbor. You can't, if you're wearing a turban, it has to be blue, and your belt has to be blue. You can't take a Muslim name. You can't have a Muslim signet ring.
Their culture?
They're trying to keep people from assimilating into their culture.
I think also they had to get rid of church bells.
Yeah, your church bells couldn't be too loud. If they were too loud, you were penalized. You couldn't bury your dead near a Muslim cemetery. You couldn't raise pigs if a Muslim lived near you. There were 31 rules total. They also applied to the Zoroastrians and the Jewish populations that the Muslims took over during this time, and the same rules applied to churches as to Zoroastrian temples and Jewish synagogues. But generally, there's just a lot of things. If a Muslim comes to your house and asks for hospitality, you have to take care of them for up to 3 days, stuff like that. The guy who allegedly wrote it is Umar ibn al-Khattab, I think, and he is the second caliph. So it was Muhammad, then the first caliph, Abu Bakr, and then Umar here. There's no pictures of Umar, but there is a picture of his sword, which is nice. He allegedly wrote it between 634 and 644, because that's when he was in charge of the caliphate. But some scholars think that this was a fabrication by later politicians making it, just trying to attribute it to this guy, because pretty much everyone likes Umar. And it was written anywhere between 100 to 200 years after Umar died. So there's 3 different viewpoints of he actually wrote it, but that's not really hugely supported. Someone about 100 years later wrote it, or it was just Umar II was 100 years later, so he might have written it. And then the third option is it was just no one really knows who wrote it, but it was up to 200 years after Umar I was dead. How to get out of the Pact of Umar. The book states that if you volunteered for military service, you got out of the pact. You didn't have to follow the rules anymore, which for some aspects of it would be really nice. There's no legal dress code anymore. You're allowed to have titles and honors. Like, that opens up the possibility of going into politics, because before you couldn't hold any title unless you were a Muslim. This gets you out of that restriction of the pact, and just you could build a church. You'd have to do it by yourself because no one else is allowed to help you unless they also served in the military. But and things like that. You still weren't equal to a Muslim, but you had the right to do what you wanted without following all of the restrictions that the pact laid out. The other way to get out of the pact was to break one of the rules, which made you an outlaw. You had no legal protections if you broke the Pact of Umar. It was kind of hey, as long as you follow all these things, we're cool. Don't worry about it. It was essentially just a list of extra laws placed on non-Muslims. And if you broke it, then no laws protected you anymore. So like the law of, hey, if you steal from someone, you get your hand cut off. It doesn't apply if you're stealing from someone who broke the Pact of Umar. So it was generally a good idea to follow the pact, just because it kept you protected under the law. And why was it written? It was written mostly as a way of organizing society, I would say, looking at it. It shows an attitude towards outsiders similar to early Rome, where citizenship was this closely guarded thing, and it was like the in to all sorts of advantages in society. When you're under the pact, you're kept out from the majority of society. It's hard to lose your outsider status. Like, the only way to get out is to join the military, but living under the pact isn't the worst thing. I think that's my phone actually going off. So it keeps the populations of the minorities in the caliphate easily marked, because Christians have to wear blue, Jewish people have to wear black, and Zoroastrians have to wear yellow at all times just to mark them out. And if any of them are caught with weapons, they've broken the pact. So it's hard to get away with plotting any conspiracies, because you can instantly identify all the members of any group. And it did establish a working relationship and a peace once the wars were over, between the different groups. Living under the pact wasn't the worst thing in the world, because you weren't getting murdered like if you were a Christian when Christianity was illegal in Rome. It was a much better position to be in. Yes?
I had a question. They didn't have a lot of Buddhists or anything, but say if there were like Buddhists or Taoists or something, what do you think they would have to wear since Christians had to wear blue?
I don't know. Red was like a color that a lot of people wore, and purple was a sign of royalty, so probably something other than red or purple.
And also, it seems in the house like really Rome, it was kind of like, people like how in Rome people had to be like, a Roman citizen to do certain things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very similar, but instead of being a Roman citizen to get access to things, if you were a dehemi, that's the word for someone living under the pact, you didn't have access. So there wasn't like a special name for not being under it, but and for some groups like Jews, it was way better to be Jewish under the Pact of Umar than it was to be under the Christian rule before the Muslims took over. Because before the Muslims took over, there was a complete ban on Jewish people entering Jerusalem if they didn't already live there. So like if you wanted to go to the temple, you couldn't. But now, when the Muslims took over, they're like, yeah, you can go to your temple, you just can't rebuild it. Or you can't rebuild any synagogues, which was already a rule that the Christians had established. So for Jewish people, got a little bit better because most of the rules were already there for them under Christian law, and they could go into Jerusalem, which was new for them. And that is the Pact of Umar.
The Pact of Umar. Any questions? Any comments? Any criticisms? Any affirmations? Any, all right. Well, yeah, I think it's interesting. Eventually I believe bells are outlawed completely.
Okay.
Because in a lot of the Muslim world, and they actually have to go to using, they take a sheet of metal, almost like a gong-like thing. They take a metal and they hit it with have a thing that swings over and hits it.
So from our source, I had the book of Eparch. It was also known as the Prefect as well.
Prefect, yeah.
But the book of Eparch is a Byzantine guide addressed to the Eparch of Constantinople. It's based on established customs and laws. The book is an essential document in the economic history of the Byzantine and Mediterranean. The book is essentially a list of regulations concerning the private guilds that had existed in the Greek world since Roman times. And also, like, the book appears to highlight a cross-section of the areas where public interest and private went together, showing how a good city should be run to keep its black market under wraps. So the text is divided into 22 chapters. The first 19 are in regards to like specific guilds. But the first chapter, the College of Notaries, is the longest chapter in the work, and it predates the other chapters. The chapter sets strict regulations for entry into the College of Notaries, and then the remaining chapters are much smaller than the first chapter, and they discuss 18 other guilds, often with similar clauses. And then just to give like a kind of like quick chapter list of what they entailed.
So these are the different guilds that they gave rules for?
Yeah.
That's interesting. See the list.
And like a lot of it, and then on like for my questions, they talked about the bankers and the grocers, and they pretty much explained like their rules and like pretty much kind of similar to that. Whatever, if they went against any of the rules, either they lost a hand, they lost their job, it's anything really. They got beaten. It was pretty brutal.
It's interesting. You have three different groups. You have merchants who import silk, merchants that deal with raw silk, merchants that deal with the dressing of raw silk and the dyeing of silk. You got four separate things just dealing with silk. Very interesting. Got the most.
Pretty much the purpose of it was to use, it was just a way for the eparchs to police the market, seek order, decrease crime, and guarantee cheap supplies. So that no one's just getting played, pretty much. Evidence from the text suggests that guilds were exclusive and privileged and intended for the rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer. And just another reason was for the efficiency raising of revenue through taxation. So it just illustrates the ways in which the government attempted to direct the economy. And that was it.
Okay. Any questions there? I want to make sure we're clear about what a guild is. 18 other guilds, right? A guild is it's not really a union, right? Not quite a union, although that might be the closest thing that we have to it. I think probably the closest thing we have to a guild in our modern world is the American Medical Association. The American Medical Association sets the rules for doctors, right? For their licensing. If you're not licensed, they set the rules as high. They also set the rules for training. It's kind of approve the medical college and medical colleges, right? To get your degree and then to maintain your status. They also, to be quite honestly, limit the number of people who can be doctors. We could have a lot more doctors, but the American Medical Association has to approve somebody starting a medical college. You can't just start one. Med school has to be approved. The instructors have to be approved. And so they limit the number of schools. By limiting the number of schools, they limit the number of doctors. Also, if you want to come from another country into our country to be a doctor, you also have to go through them as well. So they want to make sure there aren't too many doctors, because if there's too many doctors, then they're going to end up like lawyers, where they're not actually making any money. Like a lot of lawyers I mean, there's so many lawyers that a lot of them aren't doing that well, right? Anyway, you can talk to lawyers about that. I've talked to several about it because in my previous incarnation in a different location, the history degree was also combined with the pre-law degree. So I worked with lawyers there. Anyway, so they limit the number. So that's what's happening here too, is you don't want everybody and his brother to be out there, like say for example, making soap or selling fish. Because if they do, guess what? The overall prices are going to go down. If I can go anywhere and get my fish or my silk or whatever, or my, then, well, so they want to limit that so that they control people's access and they control the guild controls the whole process. That keeps people from avoiding certain taxes and things. It also means you don't get overloaded in a certain city or town, And the guild would decide this community is only large enough to have one bank, or one fishmonger, or two fishmongers, or something like that. We're not going to have 5 fishmongers here. Okay. If you live close to the water, then you might be easy for people to sell fish, but they're not going to let that happen. So it's a control thing, and it does function in a way as a trade organization, regulatory, as well as training. So for many of these, there will develop, and it does develop in the medieval period, that there are systems whereby someone could become a soap maker, a candle maker, a butcher, a blacksmith. These things could be controlled. And so what would happen is, let's say you live out in the countryside and you have a farm and you have a spare son, right? You got a son that a young son that you've got enough sons to sort of cover the work that you're doing. And maybe your son's kind of bright and you want to see what he can do. You might go in and negotiate a position for your son with the local craftsman. Typically that would stay in the family, but sometimes somebody might need, I could use somebody. And then what the deal would be is that your son would not be paid. They would work for free. But what they would get is a place to sleep and food to eat. And training. They would be learning how to be a maker, a butcher or a baker or whatever it was. They would be learning that trade by helping the guy do it. And then as they got older and more experienced, he would give them more responsibility. At first, maybe they're just hauling the flour in, right? All right, mix that up for me. No, you're not mixing it up right. Do it like this. And then later on, it might be kneading the dough, right, and actually forming the loaves and baking them in the oven. It's taking them out, and how do we deal with that? How do we do all that work to make the bread good, right? Make it something that people want to eat. And then, and typically that apprenticeship, as it was called, would last 7 years. That was it could last different ages, but 7 years was very typical. So let's say your son is 9, 10, 11. They would do this for 7 years till they're 17, 18, something like that. Then they could be hired by the same guy to be to work in the bakery, right? And then they could work on really becoming a master of the trade, for which they would have to do a masterpiece, right? They would have to be then approved by the guild that you are now I mean, just because you finish your apprenticeship and you work in the bakery doesn't make you a baker. You've got to be approved by the Bakery Guild. And to do that, you've got to show you're proficient in all those measures, and they kind of judge you on that. Okay? So that is where we get the idea of a masterpiece. Masterpiece. Once you become a master of the trade or the craft, again, it doesn't mean you have your own shop. Probably means you get paid a little bit more, and maybe that by this time the baker sort of hands over a lot of the duties to you, but it doesn't mean he's handed over the bakery to you. And it also doesn't mean you can go out and start your own bakery and compete with the guy that trained you. No, that's not going to happen either. Again, the guild controls that. Maybe there will be an opening for a bakery in another town. And so the guild will say, well, there's no openings here in this town. But if you want to go over to this town, you could start a bakery there. So then you'd have your own shop. So that's sort of the way the process works. And these are the rules. What he's going over here are the customs and the laws that govern these things. And these really developed in the medieval period, and they certainly spread across Europe. Here he's talking about the Byzantine side of it, and I think that's why there's so much silk there, because the Byzantine Empire actually became a silk producer. The way they became a silk producer was through stealing. That when they would send emissaries to China, they were very interested in the silk, and they would show them about the silk, but they found out that the silkworms like to eat mulberry leaves and mulberry, that kind of stuff. They are connected with mulberry trees. So the first thing the Byzantines did is they snuck out seedlings and cuttings of mulberry trees. They came back to the Byzantine Empire. They began to grow and cultivate mulberry trees until they got them to grow well. And then the emissaries went back and they snuck out silkworms. They actually put this stuff inside hollowed out canes, walking sticks. So it was like a tube. They put the silkworms down in there. They could walk out without being noticed. So it's smuggling, right? And they brought out the silkworms, and then they were able to get the silkworms to grow, and so they started making their own silk. And that continues to today. There are silkworms in Turkey, what would be Turkey today, but they made silk rugs, silk clothing, that sort of thing. All right, any other questions here? All right.
Quran.
So I did the Quran. The background, Muhammad actually never. It's like based off of Muhammad and his teachings, but Muhammad never really tried to write down what he was saying. He really was just like an oral speaker, is what the book said. After his death, the Caliph Abu Bakr ordered the people closest to him, so like his other prophets, to collect all the oral and like the minimal written stuff he had and put it into a book. And then it was kind of just spread around, and it was modified a little bit here and there. And then the next caliph, Uthman, he declared it was the law of God. He was like, you know what? This one right here is all Qurans must look like this one. And it became the uniform Quran that we basically know today. The Muslims, they try to memorize the Quran just as like the way to live their life. And then the passage that it talked about was chapter 114 or something like that out of it. I think it was 114. And it's comparing like Islam, Judaism, and Christianity to each other. It's kind of weird because like two of the three came first. So the books, the Quran believed that itself, the Old Testament and the New Testament, were all written as books of revelation from God. Christian and Jews were both given their perspective books by God, but they strayed away from God. Like they didn't follow all the books of God, which I mean is like the religion of Islam doesn't either. So, I guess they just didn't go to the Quran. That was probably the problem. So Christians, Jews were both given. Oh, just kidding. I read that one. So what it said was basically we should give up the New Testament, the Old Testament, and go specifically to the Quran. Muhammad was powerful over everything. So a quote from the book was, God chose Adam and Noah in the house of Abraham in the house of Ermin. So Ermin was the father. This is like the explanation of like Jesus and who he was, basically. So Ermin was the father of like the Virgin Mary, and Ermin was told by Muhammad that his grandson was going to be different, and that's what it was kind of left at. And it basically goes through like the whole like leading up, basically like the nativity scene for Mary, because he's about to like become a father with Mary, and he's like, your daughter one day is going to be a very different woman. She's going to have a weird son, and here you go. And he's like, well, I guess I got to go with it. So, was it done? Yes, I was. So Jesus was described as one of God's creatures. He was not a divine person. I don't know why a creature, but that's what it said. The Torah and the Gospel post-date, it said that it post-dated Arabs because Abraham was the beginning of the father of Islam. So, like, the Torah came after Abraham, like, it was written later, and same with the Gospel. So, they were predating Christianity and Judaism, and then they were saying that Abraham was Muslim. Then the book goes on, or the chapter then goes on to call all Jews and Christians idolaters, and just saying that, like, unless they go into Islam, there's really no point in them, like, doing what they're doing. And then the Arabs, like, claim descent from Ishmael, and then if you don't follow Islam, you're a loser. And it actually says that in it, so I was like kind of laughing when I was doing this. But yeah, it was a really short thing. I was kind of sad. I was expecting more.
Well, you could have read the entire Quran.
No thanks.
Yeah, but his interpretation wouldn't be valid if you read it in Arabic.
Well, none of our interpretations are valid, but that never stopped us before.
True.
Any questions? Is that it? Is that your last one? Oh, okay. All right.
I told you, it was a really quick one.
Some artwork from the medieval period.
So I had the Barberini, is that how you say it? Barberini ivory in the altar. And, well, the chapter first started with it being Theodoric's dream of basically creating a new Roman civilis failed, but that failed with Italian Romans and the Ostrogoths. Theodoric died by Emperor Justinian when he was invaded. The Ostrogoths ended up disappearing for about 3 decades because they were weakened by Justinian's men. But there were new invaders in 568 in Italy, and those were the Lombards. The Lombards appeared in 568. They were one of the most destructive of all invaders to enter the western region of Rome. At first, they just wanted to try and raid Italy, take their valuables, but they settled in, and they started to become like the Romans. They converted from Arianism to Roman Catholicism, adopted many of the other attitudes and habits of people of Italy. They never ended up truly conquering Italy, but were a major political military force until the late 8th century. I thought I was going to talk more about the Lombards being more about their, I guess, military and more about invading, but
they talked about the artwork, which actually shocked me because I didn't know they were actually pretty good at art. Most of their work is still exists today. One of their great masterpieces is the Christ and Majesty altar, frontal of Ratchis, king of the Lombards. Ratchis was once the king, but left the throne to becoming monk. This shows a conversion into Christianity. The West, and usually the West borrowed classical Mediterranean styles of art. So they weren't originals, but yeah, they took work from others. The chapter or the source talked about several of these Barberini ivories that were made from like certain people, and this one right here, they like the best, I guess you could say, because it has one of the best details, and it just it just has really good art to it. I don't have an artist's eye, but that looks pretty cool. The guy on the horse, what do you
Pointer things in the top middle.
oh
There's a button. Yeah, right there.
yeah,
There you
so this right here is supposed to either be Anastasius or Justinian. Historians don't really know, but the horseback emerges out the panel. Beneath the horse are
Scythians.
Scythians and Indians offering tokens of submissions. The
Scythians are the ones on the left with the pointy hats. In the bottom left, see the guy has kind of pointy hats.
yeah, I see it now.
Yeah, those are the Scythians. Scythians come from the steppes of Russia. They were known as great warriors who often rode on horseback and take a lot of people out.
The Constantinople. That's a lot.
Constantinopolian.
10. Yeah. Artist has preserved Greco-Roman naturalism. Christians had been adapting pagan artistic conventions since the 1st century. So, out of the three that I'm going to talk about, this is probably the best one. There wasn't really any like website that actually like mentioned who are all three of them, but the book talked in detail about the artwork, about like this one. They bashed this one because it was different from the last one. It was 2-dimensional. Hands of the angel's arms are out of proportion, and basically they just called it really ugly, but they liked it because it was at least
Maybe
an
angels
attempt.
have big hands.
Maybe hey, I didn't think of that, but
Yeah, could be.
but yeah, they basically just talked about the artwork and how this right here is just many of the things is out of proportion, and it wasn't that great of art, but they appreciated it because it was obviously an art, well preserved. And the third one, Lombardic in Majesty, this one violated virtually all the canons of classical sculpture, but it works, and it works brilliantly. They thought of this one as really great art, but it's not. It's certainly not Greco-Roman, so they had appreciated it more because of its beautiful art, but not because of it being more Greco-Roman. So yeah, this thought it was pretty cool how it had like, I don't know if that's a lion's body. I'm assuming it's a lion's body.
Yeah, it's a griffin. Probably we call it a griffin. A lion's body with wings, winged lion.
Mm-hmm.
It's a line of eagle wings.
And looks like it has a
And they also usually have eagle heads.
That looks like a tiger head. But yes, very, very striking. I do like it.
Yeah.
How
And
much for that one? I want that for my house.
I didn't. I didn't look up if they were for sale. And yeah, that was it. They just talked about 3 of their artworks.
All right. Yes, take all questions.
Ivory. I noticed there's a panel that was just completely empty. Do you know what that reason is for?
For
Barberini.
One more?
the first one.
Yeah.
This side.
Yeah, there's an entire panel.
Actually, they didn't mention anything about that, and I just noticed that. But I'm assuming it would probably be another angel, or
Probably was stolen. Or destroyed.
actually just not borrowed.
Or permanently. I like to permanently borrow things sometimes. You can use this, or you can just press the space bar if you like.
Okay.
All right. Here's our next one. Procopius.
Okay, for my thing, I did Procopius on the buildings and the secret history, which is basically this whole presentation is about Justinian and everything. So, yeah, and Justinian, he was one of the last emperors of Constantinople that spoke Latin as his original native tongue, which obviously Latin was the original Roman language of the Roman Empire, and he tried to conquer the West but failed, and he considered himself to be a God-anointed emperor who took his job seriously and set up for Christian Orthodoxy, because obviously at the time, in the medieval times, the Orthodox Church was, of the East, and the West was of the Catholics. So, yeah, both the Egyptians and Syrians felt alienated by the strong Christian faith, obviously, because they were obviously pagans or Muslim at the time. So, and one of his great accomplishments was he was known as Justinian the Great, and he was the last ever, traditionally Roman emperor, and the first ever Byzantine emperor. So it'd be like the old and the new. So that'd be like the end of an era and the beginning of one. So, and he was responsible for the completion and the codification of the imperial Roman law. It's still, in that tradition, even though it's Byzantine. And after there was an urban riot, which is usually common in, the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople, and he commissioned the rebuilding of many buildings like churches and public buildings. And another great accomplishment of his was the Hagia Sophia, which it almost looks like a mosque, obviously today, but back then, and even kind of today, it's a Byzantine, temple and whatever. Yeah, obviously those Turks, and which just shows a new distinct style of Byzantine architecture, and it's almost similar to Roman, obviously, because they like Roman tradition. And it increased the size of the state and acquired new states and drove out barbarians. Like, for example, they fought, invading forces like the Persians in the east, obviously, and the Visigoths and the Vandals all in the west and Europe and everything. So, and this all increased. What the heck? Yeah, and this increases power. And there was another side of Justinian that may have seen evil, and he was kind of ruthless too. And he had no problem ordering innocent men to be murdered, and he allowed priests to rob their neighbors, and sometimes he even tried to disguise his evil by requiring people to hand over things to the church. So he kind of combined the church with government and everything. So, and he killed those who were dissenters, and he killed, I don't know, literally trillion people, but he killed a lot of people and a lot of times didn't even spare wives and children, and everything he touched seemed to become a bloodbath, which is very common in Constantinople. And a partisan would say Justinian had some flaws, but his flaws and vices were weaknesses, which also showed that helped him to be a strong leader. So it wasn't just his strengths, it was also his weaknesses that, strengthened him. So, and he made people both fear him and respect his leadership. But also, he killed many people in Libya and then plundered all of Libya, and he would seize valuable land. Maybe that's... No. And he seized valuable land and then imposed taxes on people like crazy. And he treated people of Italy that rate. So, no one could escape, his authoritarianism, so... And the next slide. There was 2 books called The Secret History on the Buildings. There are The Secret History versus on the Buildings, which are 2 books that were written by someone called Procopius. And also Procopius was a courtier, and The Secret History was written around the year 500, and The Secret History was written before On the Buildings. And for The Secret History, he didn't plan on it being seen by others during his lifetime. And On the Buildings was obviously written after it, which is around 553 and 554 AD. And then On the Buildings, this book spoke very highly of Justinian and praised him as an emperor. And I think there's something about this, the reason, Procopius could write, obviously good things and nice things about the emperor while he was still living, and The Secret History was written first, and the thing is, I don't think he would have written something that really controversial first, and then turn around, write something that was, more positive. Obviously, he wouldn't do that. And if Procopius' eyewitnesses were really credible, that would make his writings more credible. And for this, both have a little value, and the readers need to think about what they really believe in each of these books. And a historian must be objective and credible, and to be balanced. But really, their reality is no one's really objective, I think. So, and eyewitnesses can be credible, but they can also be either biased, one-sided, or even deceitful by making false accusations. Like, they can even be a witness, and they can manipulate and try to twist the story of the events that they saw themselves very easily. And God and Justinian, and On the Buildings, it portrays Justinian as a God-fearing emperor who was good and a great leader. And The Secret History makes Justinian seem like an evil, murderous monster, and it implies that an evil emperor could cause God to allow earthquakes and a plague, kind of similar to what's in the Bible. It causes natural disasters for corrupt leaders. And these concepts show that there was a foundation and belief in God, with the idea that God blesses the good and punishes the evil. And this here is the ivory, that panel describing Justinian and On the Buildings books, that shows Justinian as a strong and courageous and heroic leader, and that he's trustworthy and leads people out of fear of the Lord and for the good of the people. Well, it was kind of both fear of the Lord, and also, he was kind of authoritarian, because that's typical medieval stuff. So, and if the ivory represented The Secret History, Procopius would explain that the people served Justinian out of fear instead of, respect and everything. And he let the people, it says that he would let the people through fear and intimidation, and people were afraid to show their true feelings about him for fear of being murdered in their own life. My conclusion is these 2 writings show a very different emperor, like 2 sides, 2 faces, like one that's highly loved and respected, and then one that's, feared and everything. These 2 writings show but there must be some truth to both sides in each of the writings, and the truth is that we obviously will never know which writing is actually more credible, because, we weren't even there. That was 1,000 years ago, so how would we? So, anyways, that's all I gotta say.
All right. Thank you. Any questions? All right, good job. All right. Well, we're about out of time. We got about a minute.